Well, welcome back to the My First Rodeo podcast, the show that asks really cool, interesting, and famous people about the various firsts on their path to success. Today is no exception. Today we have a really cool, interesting, and famous person, Alex Ebert, who writes for Bloomberg News. He writes in particular in the context of legal issues. And what an interesting story he has that starts in a small town in Wisconsin and family dinner conversations with a mother who has one political persuasion and a father another, but they have respectful, objective dialogue around the table. They encourage kids to do the same, and look what happens when you do that. You get a really objective writer of the news that tries to bring about truths and not presume what they are. And I think you're going to enjoy hearing more about Alex. I don't want to tell you too much because then, heck, you don't need to listen to the interview. But a lot of self-reflection on what he was like as a younger journalist and what he became as he's been at it for a little while, and with law school in between, how it changed his perspective to just get things out there versus to do it in a responsible way, in a way that considers the perspective of the participants in the process, including the judge, including the jury, including the witnesses, and people whose lives are going to be impacted by the story rather than just entertaining, which I think is what a lot of our news has become. But cool discussion about what news, in fact, is becoming, the difference between local news and national news, not just in terms of one covering local issues and one covering national issues, but in terms of the resources that are available. And unfortunately, to some degree, I wouldn't say the death of local news, but certainly the absence of a commitment to resources and the ability of those great people that tell those important local stories and hold local people accountable, their abilities to do that job, where the national news has a significant amount of resources to do that job. So while the local news is getting smaller and less impactful, and frankly, less sometimes paid attention to because of that, the national news is getting stronger, and perhaps there's a way to bridge that, or at least be cognizant of it as a reader and as a consumer of information. But we'll get to that in a few minutes. This is the first episode that we've recorded since the national elections, of course, included local elections as well. But, we don't get into politics here in any significant way, although if that's where a given interview takes us, then we do. I'll just say the obvious, that we are in a divisive time where there's winners and there's losers. And if your candidate gets elected, then you feel empowered often. And if your candidate doesn't, you feel excluded. And, it seems to be that cycle that we're in. Maybe we've always been in it, but it's so much more dramatic now. And what I dislike about it more than anything, in addition to the obvious, is just how divisive we've become as countries, as communities, as families. And I love focusing on things that could bring us together. I hope the stories that we cover here, the individuals, the lived experiences that we cover here and talk about are things that bring people together around interesting, impactful people doing interesting, impactful things. I want to personally thank those of you who support Freed to Run. We did Freed to Run for the 9th year in a row this past weekend, a 24-hour run of teams and individuals to raise money to support Jacksonville Area Legal Aid, and in particular the Shelter for Elders, which is an endowment to provide legal services for indigent senior citizens who are housing insecure, dealing with evictions, dealing with rentals, dealing with house issues, dealing with consumer fraud and reverse mortgage corruption and things of that sort. So thank you for supporting us. Freed to Run's been going for, as I said, 9 years. The first 7 were 6 marathons over 6 days to raise money also for Jacksonville Area Legal Aid for a pediatric patient endowment, the Medical Legal Partnership. And you may have one in your community, a Medical Legal Partnership, which helps families struggling with medical issues for their children get needed legal services to help with disability access, insurance issues, benefit issues, guardianship issues, and the like. So I love what Freed to Run has become, because it really is something that everybody's for and nothing can be against. We've raised almost $3 million, or at least helped Jacksonville Area Legal Aid raise $3 million, all of which is in endowments, the interest on which runs these programs. So what a cool thing that has happened because of a an idea that I helped to be the catalyst of, but it's become so much more than me. It's become individuals and community supporters. And I thank you for your continued support of Free to Run. You can find out more at freetorun.com. Still time to support and donate. I think we're just about to what our goal was this year, which was $180,000. We could use about another $12,000 to get there. So end of the year, time of giving. If you have some money that you'd like to contribute, we would welcome it. It all goes into an endowment and gets matched by the Dolores Barr Weaver Legacy Fund. Enough of that. The only thing I'll say is, try to do something like that. There's so many opportunities to get divided, to get into your information silo. And I highly recommend you find something that is beautiful and uniting rather than something sometimes not so beautiful and dividing. With that, I'm really excited to bring to you Alex Ebert, writes for Bloomberg News. Really cool guy, interesting guy. You should definitely follow what he does. And I'm excited to bring you him so you can learn more about him. This is me talking to Alex Ebert. So Alex, welcome to the My First Rodeo podcast.
It's great to be here, Mike. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's been a long time coming. I'm glad we got to do this before the end of the year. And you're one of those people I've admired the way you approach things. You're interesting, sort of multi-career upbringing in such a short period of time. Frankly, you've had multiple careers, and even within the law, multiple careers. But look forward to talking to you about some of your metaphoric first rodeos. Let's get started with your origin story. Where you're from, and what kind of family did you grow up in?
Well, thanks, Mike. Yeah, so I grew up outside Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the dinner table was always this like fun political clash because my dad was this Republican, kind of like country club Republican sort of stances. And my mom is this tough city girl Democrat. And so every single day around the dinner table was just hashing things out and never agreeing. And from that, I just sort of got this whole, question everything, skeptical about the gambit attitude about life.
I love that. And what did your folks, to the extent they worked outside the house, what did they do for a living?
Yeah, so my mom was a teacher. She got a degree from computer sciences from La Crosse University, which is a pretty small university in Wisconsin. Went to teach in Milwaukee computer science, and eventually worked up to be a network administrator. And so she can see the matrix and stuff like that, and do things in the cloud that I'll never understand. And then my dad was always a numbers guy. He was an accountant and a bookkeeper for people, and a hell of a bartender too. And nice. That's what he did.
Let's go hand in hand. When we say a bartender, you mean he would make drinks for people when they came to your house, or do you mean he actually worked in the profession?
Yeah, so he ran a club in La Crosse, which is how he and my mom met. And that was sort of his first job out of school. And so he's just a suave, sort of get to know everybody, hand on the back, friendly guy.
Wow.
And, between my rough and tumble mom and my dad, who can sort of put everyone at ease, it just sort of gave me two pathways to approach interviews when the time came.
Yeah. Now, did your dad shut down the club or the bar at some point and move only into the numbers direction?
Yeah, so they moved from La Crosse back to Milwaukee right before having me and my brother. And so the transition was from, small town where they both went to college to, the Milwaukee metro area, big city, and, looking for a way to raise a family close to resources and a good job for my mom. And it was great. My brother and I and all my friends, we loved growing up outside Milwaukee. Politically interesting place. It sort of has everything you want as a kid for resources, but it's also small enough that you can make a name for yourself if you want.
Yeah, that's neat. And your brother's older or younger?
Younger brother. He's a professor at UW Eau Claire. So I like to say he got the brains in the family, even though I got the JD before he got his PhD.
I'm sure that's not true. Reading your stuff and talking to you, I know there's brains galore in the Ebert family. So your brother professes what subject?
So he studied mathematics in undergrad, went to Cambridge to do that, but he wound up getting into marketing. the the marketing side of things, where it's you try to convince internal and external people about the purpose of an organization.
Hmm.
And so he digs into the numbers of decision making and how big companies can kind of alter decision making internally so that they can get their employees on board to make big shifts and changes.
Interesting. So he also is an objective a reporter of information so that people can make decisions.
Yeah, pretty bright dude.
Yeah, but I mean that's what I admire about what you do and the way you try to do it, it shouldn't be earth shattering because I think that's what all people in the news business should be doing and historically did do, and so often nowadays don't do is to be objective, not be the center of the story, and approach it in an objective way so people can make their own decisions about their own lives. And I feel like that's what you do. What are the origins of that approach? I mean, obviously the dinner table sounds like a pretty big part of how you're wired, huh?
It was, yeah. And, my folks made a big point of having that dinner like as consistently as we could. And just talking about everything was going on around us. And we had an amazing newspaper growing up in Milwaukee, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, where these reporters would cover crime and corruption and public policy, and they get Pulitzers, way above their weight. I like to think that they're like the Milwaukee Brewers of newspapers. They're always batting dingers and playing good defense, even though they're a small outfit. And growing up in that atmosphere and knowing that you just wanted to do that thing, get so excited about it, it was an easy transition for me. I needed to find out a way that I could do that same thing.
Yeah, and yet your initial path, and I'm guessing, did you do, some version of journalism or writing in, say, middle school, high school? Did you have that opportunity?
Yeah, absolutely. So writing for the school paper, writing essays here and there, applying for every scholarship under the sun. I heard from my hero back in the day. I read this columnist for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel since I was young. And I just reached out to him when I was in my teens and I said, Mr. Stingle, Jim Stingle, I want to do what you do. Like, nice. What is the thing that you have to do to be a reporter? And he said, it doesn't matter for who, it doesn't matter how, you just have to write. You have to write. And that
get the reps in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so that's the advice you got from, did you wind up forming a relationship with him or you just got that great advice?
Just mostly that great advice. He's a busy guy. And when I finally broke in, I went and I toured the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, which is, it used to be this bigger place, and we can, talk about sort of the collapse of the media industry in the small towns if you want. But I got to go shake his hand and tell him, like, I made it, like I got here.
Nice.
And getting to shake your hero's hand, after using their advice and, having some success, that was just the best feeling in the world.
Yeah. And hopefully for him too, because, I'm sure he had opportunity to give advice to a lot of people and you never know if it's idle or not. So to have knowledge that someone he just sent a brief message to, that it had impact on him, that's amazing. We should all be so lucky, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I hope one day I can finally give some good advice to someone and they'll thank me for it.
I bet you do. Now, so your initial path, well, let's talk about your path to college then, because I know you wind up getting a JD, a Juris Doctorate, and practicing law for a period of time in a variety of capacities. So what happens between high school and your decision to go get a JD?
Yeah. So I think this is such an interesting part that you don't hear a lot of journalists talk about. But the period where you try to break in is always what like makes or breaks it. And how that works is you just have to try a million times, try. So in high school, I knew what I wanted to do. And so I was looking to write and applying for scholarships and doing everything I could, essay contests, writing for, papers, whether it be local or applying to other things. And just hear little bits of scraps that you publish, whatever. And that built up into a little bit of a portfolio that allowed me to get scholarships to go to the University of Minnesota, where I studied undergrad with a full ride. And between that and the good grades, I was able to go in there and sort of pick my targets. And I instantly started, trying to get into local journals, whether it be arts or, the offbeat stuff that might allow a student in or not really care how old you are, what you know, and give you crazy assignments late at night or off the wall stuff just so that you have something to do and apply. And so that's really what it was. And, the folks that came up with me at that time, some people got tired of bashing their head against the wall and they gave up. Other people didn't. They just kept going. And it's not an easy path. There are, for every one person that sort of makes it in, there's going to be 10 that don't. And that's just, really how bad do you want it and how many late nights are you willing to spend like figuring this out and trying another path after you fail.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's persistence, just like it is in getting the story and getting the interview. I mean, you can't be too thin-skinned or too, lackadaisical, for lack of a better word. You have to be persistent both in your pursuit of a career and your pursuit of writing opportunities, probably your pursuit of the editor's time, and of course in your pursuit of the information for the stories that you're writing.
Absolutely, yeah. And then eventually, when you do finally get an interview lined up with someone, you have to convince them for every minute that you're on the phone with them that conversation's worth having. And it is a process for sure. My dorm room wall in undergrad was lined with rejection letters, and I just made it my wallpaper, and I would look at them every night and I'd say, it doesn't matter. I'm going to apply to another one. I'm going to apply to another thing. And, eventually it started to work, and it started to work in a huge way. There is at one point in time that I was doing a couple internships and working full time for 3 different outlets. And then it just became a matter of, picking your positions, getting your reps, building up your clips, and working on sourcing, because from there you can start to build and build and build where you want to take your career.
Yeah, I love that. In episode 30, we interviewed Kate Snow from NBC News, and she told an almost identical story when she was at Cornell for journalism. And she had just her whole dorm room papered with the rejection letters and got 1 or 2 acceptances, and that turned into all these opportunities. And now she's, doing everything that she's doing on NBC News. So
fantastic.
Did you always know that it was writing that aspect of journalism, and writing in particular for what we'll call print, although obviously it's a lot more than that nowadays, as opposed to being on air or writing for on-air personalities?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that what Miss Snow does is incredible. But at the same time, there's something that I love about getting that sort of unfiltered by the visual medium story. I learn by hearing, like, podcasts, but for me it's too slow sometimes. I need to get more. I need to get the detail that you can't really get from, a 30-second to a minute long TV story.
Right.
And once you start to study journalism, you realize, unfortunately, a lot of media is limited by a visual, right? So if I have a really cool breaking story, right, it won't air on TV unless it's a visual, right? If it's a legal ruling and you can't get a picture of the plaintiff, like, who's going to show that on TV? Or an interview with, the crying widow, right?
Right.
There's so many important things that belong in the public sphere and conversation that you can't do, especially quickly, with a visual medium like TV.
Yeah.
And so for me, I always gravitated toward the written word, because you can get a lot more of your personality, your detail, the things that brought you to the story and interest you in there. And I found that to be much more engaging than, being on screen. There's also an aspect of how pretty you are to get on TV.
Hey, what are you suggesting?
And so I've always stuck to the writing side of things. It's always fascinated me more.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I can see that. I mean, it is a slower process, and we're going to get to the audience and the evolution of the audience, and to some extent the decrease in the audience, or at least the decrease in people that are willing to, that thirst for, that even want something that takes a little bit of effort to get and to discern. But even accepting it as it used to be, as I hope it it is for some people as it is still for me. It's a, it's just well, it's a slower process, and it's always surprised me, even when I was a young lawyer and occasionally had a newsworthy story, just a local level. I I'd never appreciated it because I wasn't in journalism, that there was so much competition amongst the stations, for example, to get the story, to get the scoop, and to get an exclusive. And while I could understand how that would be ego gratifying for the station, and maybe that's something that they value, as a listener, I've never, and nor would I even have an ability to know who got the story first, other than when they take these victory laps when, we were the first to bring you the story about this guy doing this bad thing or what have you. And yet they are so conscious about getting it out quickly and, an exclusive, rather than taking the time to tell the story in a way that their listenership would most appreciate. I don't know. Where do you think that comes from?
I think there's a couple of things. I think that our attention when it comes to visual things is a lot shorter, and that's not necessarily on the visual journalist, right? They have a tough medium to work with, and they have a great revenue engine where they have the ads that they splice in. So you have to put things in between. Right. It's kind of like if you consider an old newspaper, right? It had column inches and then you had ads. It's the same thing with TV, right? It's just the amount of time is different. Mm-hmm. They've got 30 seconds to a minute to maybe a minute and a half to do something.
Yeah.
And that limits what they can do.
It's interesting because it assumes, and I know we're talking about the medium that's not your primary medium, but it assumes that I'm flipping around stations as a viewer, trying to figure out who's got the most interesting news at night. And the truth is, most, watchers of news stations, and there's not that many of them anymore, are sedentary. They've got their flavor of news, or they've got their person they've been watching for the last 10 years at the local level, and they're going to listen to whatever stories that person's telling. They're not going to be flipping stations, I don't think.
No, they're not going to flip, but you also have to think that the audience they're going for, right? It's going to be that bigger, broader audience, right?
Right.
Maybe some of the things that, especially the things that I would write about, and things that you and I have talked about over the last year, they're not really going to play as much, right? Or they'll do it in a different way. And that's not bad. It just is what it is. And that's sort of why we've had this fracture into different media outlets, right? That's why I'm so lucky to write for a legal outlet.
Yeah.
I get to focus on the stuff that's really interesting to me. And, you see a million little websites and blogs, a lot of them, don't have the audience we have, but, they focus on a particular set of issues and things that folks want. But, TV, they're going to have to play for that bigger audience, and they got to do it in those like little snippets. And that's a tough road to hoe.
Yeah. And one last odd detour to take you on, but I've often thought that they spend way too much time on the weather in this day and age. I mean, it's a good third of a 30-minute news presentation in the evening, and the only thing I care about the weather is maybe 30 seconds of what it's going to be tomorrow, you think, because obviously they're not going to be accurate most of the time. But if I want to know what the weather, I generally don't want to know what the weather was. And I've got my phone that's going to tell me probably more current information than you're able to report, because by the time you're reporting it, my phone's already updated it. But are people just that used to the weather that they enjoy hearing 10 minutes of it every night?
I mean, what else are you going to talk about around the water cooler?
I guess.
Yeah, I like to joke about this, and I've thought it a lot too, but then I became a parent, right? And, my wife and I are always trying to plan for when we're going to go to the farmer's market. When are we going to invite the grandparents or great grandparents to something that's outside? Mm-hmm. And, is it going to snow or rain or whatever? And so I don't know, like as much as I love to hear hard news and see hard news, I got to admit, now that I'm mm-hmm. dad, that weather plays high on my list.
You're looking at the high pressure and the low pressure fronts, huh? All right. I'm impressed. I'm the minority there for sure. So take us from your journalism training in college and getting those opportunities and presumably some acceptance letters to go with all the rejection letters. And then how does that set you on a path towards law school? And then ultimately law school set you on a path towards a very different type of journalism.
Yeah, absolutely. So my pathway in journalism was marked by all of these little detours into courtrooms and into legal proceedings. And some of them are extraordinary and seem crazy, and some of them are mundane but really meaningful. But they piled up until eventually I had this sort of breakthrough that said, this is where I need to go and what needs to happen. But they were, everything from doing a cop story that, broke through nationally and was picked up around the country, to covering protests and being thrashed and pepper sprayed by the police outside of the Republican National Convention. There were times when, I was in the courtroom for groundbreaking verdicts that were, huge and garnered international attention because of what they stood for. And then there were times where it was, standing next to the family in a courtroom and, seeing a conviction for, the person who had killed their daughter or their son. And, you just feel this pull of the legal system, the courtroom, as a journalist, or at least I do, because of the inherent conflict in it. The difficulty of deciding what was ethical, what was right, what was wrong, and how we figure out what to do about it. And so those different things brought me to this one courtroom that really stands out in my mind. I was inside of this small town courtroom covering this trial, and it was this cold case. It was pretty sad. It was this woman who, for like 20 years, her murder was unsolved, and the police finally had fingered someone that they thought had done it. And they were bringing this person in after 20, 30 years of this unsolved murder. And the jury was in voir dire, right? They were picking it. And I saw sitting in the risers, or the different pews that you have in the courtroom where the press and the public sit, that this person was using the Reader's Digest to like hold his notes.
This is one of the jurors.
Yeah, the juror. And he would occasionally, flip it open and look at it and, read it or make marks in it. And, I filed my story about the voir dire, and I called out in there that one of the jurors in this high profile case didn't seem to be paying attention because he was reading the Reader's Digest. And, that's one of the 12 people that's going to decide, life in prison for this guy.
Right.
And the very next day I come back to cover more voir dire, and the judge pulls me aside. He brings me to his courtroom. He says, Alex, come here.
How does he actually does this personally, or send somebody to summon you?
Personally.
Okay, so he walks over to you and knows your name because you're in a small town, I take it?
Exactly, yeah.
All right.
And I was in the courtroom the day before, so he recognizes me. Mm-hmm. I go inside there, and it's just me and him. And he lays into me. He's so furious. And he, sort of spells out the stakes. He says, like, listen, this is justice for a family. This is innocence or guilt for this man. And if you ever have like another thing about a juror on my panel, I need to know about it to fix it. He said, I don't want you writing about that. Mm. And I told him, Your Honor, like, it's my job. Like, I have to write about that. People are going to want to know if a juror is not paying attention. And he says, you'll feel differently when you're a lawyer. And then he just walks out of the room. Mm. And that was such a strong moment for me because it kind of reverberated inside of me. I was like, this man cares so much about the upholding of this process, the making it work, the fixing mistakes, the perception of his team, everything like that. How could he feel so differently than I do? I need to know more about that. And it just stuck with me for years.
Now, he said you'll feel differently when you went to law school. At that moment, were you planning to go to law school, and did he know it?
No, I wasn't. And he didn't know it. It was another 3 years before I went, but it just kept hanging in the back of my mind, sort of echoing. And it sounded like the things that I've heard from other people along the way that, I've interviewed and asked questions about the law or the way they had set things up. And it just echoed in the back of my mind again and again and again, the way these people would talk about, like, you'll be a lawyer one day, like, you're going to do this, like, you get this system, you're going to be a great legal mind, whatever. Like, they would blow smoke, but they just kept happening. And because of that, it really opened up my eyes. Like, maybe this is something I can do. I think this might work.
So no interest or no plans anyway to go to law school when you graduated. You were going to be a writer and you were going to write journalism, and that's what you did. It so happened that a lot of your stories, or at least some of them, involved the legal process. And I've always thought it's difficult. It's sometimes difficult to read when people that aren't lawyers are writing legal stories, because inevitably there's going to be things you're going to miss if all you grew up on was maybe Law and Order. Did you find that law school really opened up your eyes and your ability to tell the stories better?
Certainly, absolutely. The difficulty, right, is in journalism, especially written journalism, you focus on the impact of something. That's sort of how you avoid bringing your bias into it, right? If you can focus on impact, what is happening, right, then it's not a judgment of whether this is good or bad, right? It's a judgment of describing for your reader what's happening, who's doing it, what the impact and difference made will be. And you can't really do that unless you have that analytical force behind you, right? You need to understand at least a little bit about the process, the players, the environment in order to do it. So yes, I mean, law school was immensely helpful for me. Yeah. There are many great world-class journalists that can cover legal proceedings and don't have a law degree, but I find that it can be really, really challenging, especially to quickly tackle legal issues if you don't have that background.
Do you find that some of your sources or people you want to talk to, if that's different than a source, are more receptive to talking to you because they know that you are educated in the law and have a JD?
Yeah, certainly. It's made a lot of things easier, especially talking with jurists, because we can sort of skip past the things that you would understand. If once you've been like behind the bar, which is, what they call entering into a courtroom and moving that cool little swingy door and like walking into the side where the lawyers and the judges hang out. Once you've been there and seen that, you can kind of skip all of the throat clearing and get to the real nut of the case. Right.
Ask the good questions. Yeah.
And it's not like there aren't, non-lawyer journalists that can do it. They definitely can.
Sure.
But it really does help sometimes with those conversations because they're not explaining to me the implications of a motion to dismiss or a summary judgment standard or, why they needed a certified complaint, anything like that, right? You can just skip to the, how did this come about? Who's benefiting, who's losing, and you can avoid all that other stuff.
Yeah, then you have to go, for lack of a better word, simplify it for your readers, some of whom are not lawyers. But I'm sure it's no different than somebody writing for Bloomberg that covers medical topics. If they are surgeons, they're going to be better able to ask the right questions of the surgeon for that story about surgery. But again, then they have to explain it to the broader readership.
Yeah, and the way journalists get around this in a way, or get a deeper understanding of this, is we rely on other people, right? Especially when it comes to complex areas of regulation or the law. Like, I'm texting people all the time, calling people all the time, like, I don't get this. Explain it to me like, I'm your friend at the bar, Let's say we're playing darts and I ask you about this, like, how are you going to break it down for me? Something like that. And, once you get a, Rolodex of people that are fine because they trust you explaining these things, then you can rely on that to provide the background that you need to report.
That makes sense.
And I think that there's a lot of people that don't, they sort of see the written or the video display of journalism, the story, right? But they don't really see the like iceberg beneath it, where it's the like 10, interviews someone's done to understand the topic, that those people aren't mentioned in the story because maybe they don't want to be, that will get you where you are, right? And looking for those things is a little bit easier once you have that law degree.
Yeah, to contextualize it and then contextualize it for your readers as well. I wonder the story that you were covering, the case that you were covering, where that judge gave you an earful, where you had reported on the juror or prospective juror reading the Reader's Digest, perhaps when they were supposed to be taking in other information. You seem to have an unusual ability to, although you didn't necessarily appreciate or obey that perspective of the judge at the time, you perceived that he had a different objective, different perspective than you did. Do you think you would handle that one differently if you were writing that same story today?
Gosh, that's such a great question. I don't know if I would. I don't think I'd do that one differently. But and the reason why is different now than when I started, right? When I started, I was kind of a hard charging jerk. And I was one of these people that believed, truly all information needed to be shared at all times. And that was sort of my reason going in there. Now, I think I would have shared it because that probably, prevented like a mistrial down the road, because he was able to address that with the juror and with counsel. And, that wasn't an issue. Like it sort of headed off, bigger problems down the road. So, I mean, my reasoning definitely has changed. And it's strange how you can kind of like come full circle on something and still wind up in the exact same place that you started.
Yeah, just more, I don't know, empathetic or empathic or appreciative of the other perspective, but still, you have a different job to do, even though as a lawyer now you can appreciate the judge's perspective and, how significant that information being in the public domain would be to him. He's just trying to run a trial. That's it.
Yeah. And I'm much more judicious, to use kind of a loaded word now, with using people's names, especially when it comes to folks that, wind up in the legal system and they didn't intend to be there, right? When I was a young, hard-charging reporter, like I said, I would put everybody's name in there, and there were so many students or other people that, made the news in a way that, the internet's forever, and sometimes I do regret, getting them that attention when they didn't want it. And that's a sincere thing that I look back and think I could have done that better a few times.
Yeah. Can you give any examples of how you might approach it differently and why?
Yeah. I mean, it kind of runs the gambit between, figuring out how to write about something as a topic instead of as a person, right? I think that would provide a little bit of, soft cushioning for the people that have run into it, right? And then there's just some times when I think I just wouldn't even write a story. I'm going to anonymize this as much as possible, but there was a story that I broke going through police records that was this sort of notorious incident at a big college football game. And these two people that were from opposing teams got arrested because they were having fun with each other in the bathrooms.
Gotcha.
And this made like national news when I reported it. And down the road, like the local newspapers like went to their houses like a decade after this, just to like ask them what their lives were like after. And like, if I hadn't reported that story because I thought it was newsy, even though it was, and it was interesting, like those people's lives would be very different. And that's, I don't know, I think about that a lot. And I'm sure there's other times when, I've reported stories like that, and I just don't know about any fallout, right? So yeah, I try to be a lot more cautious now that I'm older.
Do you draw a distinction? And I'm sure it sounds like you did not when you were younger, but now, do you draw a distinction between people in the public domain and people that, otherwise are pretty anonymous, living their lives, and occasionally do stupid things that are newsworthy?
Yeah, almost certainly. And even when folks that are, living their lives, get their cases, before our sort of like eye of Sauron in the media, right? I try to do my best to minimize the amount that I'm using their names to the extent that it's ethical, right? if there's someone that's utilizing the court to, bring a legal proceeding, obviously, like, your name's already in the public and you're doing that. But, if you're getting dragged before something, I do try to the extent I can, minimize the amount of exposure I provide. And I think that's something that, this job and this company is really great at doing, right? So we, in the legal media, can really focus on the impact of a ruling and the systemic things that occur because of a development. And because of that, you can sort of get around a little bit more of the hot white light on some people.
Right.
And we also, I think, especially my company, do a tremendous job of putting that hot white light on the people that really put themselves out. So, like, every single, Trump appointee is going to get hot white light from, my outlet and other DC and New York outlets. And it's the same thing with, people that are running for the state Supreme Courts. We're going to, kick rocks and look under things and give them lots of attention. And so I think that really, putting that hot white light where it belongs now is something I think a lot about, and do it more cautiously as I get older.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, does that, in your mind, does that hot white light include things, or it obviously starts with things like, what is their jurisprudence, or what is their jurisprudence likely to be? But when you get into things that are more attenuated, both in terms of time and related to being on the bench, how do you draw that line, if you draw it? Obviously, the Brett Kavanaugh, example comes to mind, but there's plenty of other ones where he was, sort of after the fact, alleged to have engaged in sexual assault when he was younger and at a party and had a lot to drink. I'm oversimplifying it, of course. So, how do you figure what's in and what's out from that hot white light?
Yeah. So I think that, frankly, like, if there are allegations of misconduct against any public figure that, like, is in our beat, like, those should really be investigated, like, flat out, right? Like, that sort of stuff is extremely important. And yeah, I don't, regret really any effort that a journalist puts into, looking into the background or allegations about folks. I think we can suffer if the allegations are specious and it doesn't look like we were circumspect. And I think that is really difficult line to draw. And I'll tell you why. Because there are some pretty bad folks that do get exposed and do get kicked out because of great journalism. You've got some great journalists in Florida that have done some fantastic stuff around Epstein, is a good example. And if it isn't for that, the investigation into the background, the sincere asking of questions and seeking records, you're not going to get it. And that impact isn't going to get made. So it's really hard to tell anyone to say hold back, right? I think what it comes down to is at a story level, right? Do you have the details and the goods to back up what you're saying in print, right?
Right.
And that, I think, is a really hard judgment call to make. And I think it's hard for every publication that gets it.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've sat on the phone with someone who you told you were about to write a story about them, or maybe it was one of their handlers, but and it's about an allegation that someone made against them, and their response is some sort of, oh, that person was crazy, that was all disproven, they went away, you should talk to 6 other people who will tell you they're crazy as well. And in that moment, because that's not an uncommon narrative, and frankly, it's not an uncommon situation. People do make unfounded allegations. People sometimes are crazy. But I'm sure you've heard that disproportionate to the number of times that's actually turned out to be the case. And so in that moment, when you're deciding a deadline, do we write the story just saying that this man or this woman had these allegations made against them? Because once that's out there, you can't unring that bell either, not effectively. So what do you do with that fork in the road?
Yeah, I think you have to weigh the allegations and see if there's something there, right? And it's when it comes to, like, an allegation of something that's really serious, like, there have been times when I've had those conversations with people, and those allegations have not borne out. And there have been times when I've had those conversations with people, saying that these allegations aren't true, and those allegations have borne out, right? Sure. And because of that, like if you have something solid, like as a journalist, and if the deadline is, a real requirement there, yeah, I'd say like you have to weigh like the cost benefit of not publishing that. So
Right. Just an allegation.
Public figure, serious allegation. There's a little, credibility to it. Like, right. Yeah. I do think though that the really important thing, right, is to take the counter response seriously, right? And if I were to, just say there's one thing that I've tried to get better on over my career is to, try to put myself into the position of someone who's not going to benefit from a story and say like, what is your best argument here that I can, give to the reader?
Right.
Because I think there's a lack of, good faith oftentimes in journalism, and, folks might not be trying to elevate the arguments of folks they disagree with. And if we can try to elevate arguments on every side and try to get to more of a factual place, I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, and part of that, I assume, is not calling someone at deadline, assuming they're going to give you a no comment so that you just get to report, reached them and they gave no comment. You try to give them more time to respond. And if they say, we'll give you a fulsome response, maybe you give them another day to give you that fulsome response.
Yeah, and I think that there's a difference between stuff that's like breaking and stuff that's long and plotting, right? Mm-hmm. So, a good example is like oftentimes you'll never get a response even no matter how you try, right?
Right.
I've had stories where for weeks I've looked into a particular person who's getting a top spot on a state court and asked them for comment about particular things in their past, and you just don't get it, right? And that's, trying and trying and trying. It doesn't work. And then there's particular things where it's, okay, we've got, a complaint filed, or we've got a brief filed and it has this allegation and it's filed with the court, right? So a plaintiff and attorney's putting their name on it. Yeah, I will seek an immediate comment and hope someone gets back to me and update the story with their response. But it's not like you're not gonna publish the story quickly just because
it was a lawsuit.
You don't hear back.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That seems like a fair path to be on. So you graduate law school, and at that point, are you intending to get back into journalism? Because I know you practiced law for a number of years.
No, yeah, I wasn't intending to get back in at all. I was sort of dead set on being a civil litigator. I loved it. It was great. The negotiations where everything looks like it's going to hell and you finally like iron out like an agreement everyone can sort of live with. Sure. Late night in a federal courthouse.
Right.
The, working on briefs till the early morning hours thinking, oh, this is going to really nail it with the judge. I mean, that sort of stuff is intoxicating. There are a lot of things about it that were less so, like the, hours of printing documents for depositions, but it was a blast. I really, really loved it.
Yeah. So what moves you back to the path of journalism? I know some of the story, but share it with our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So I lost my job, and it really boiled down to my boss didn't like the amount of FaceTime I had when I had my first child. So, we are living in Columbus, Ohio, mid-sized firm, big-sized city, needed to leave the office around 5 every day to get the kid from daycare before it closed down. And even though I was opening up the office at 7:30 in the morning before anyone else got there, it just came to this point where, it's a late night. We need something filed. Alex isn't around.
Right.
I can't be. My wife is a pediatric surgeon, and there's just, some things that you have to put your foot down if you're going to be the kind of father you want to be and, support your family. And it's really where it boiled down. It was a crazy experience. I had all this stuff in my office, and, I had like knickknacks, and one of them is my grandfather's mariachi hat. He was a terrible, terrible guitar player and singer in Milwaukee. His name was Ishmael Ruiz. And so I had this hanging on my wall, right, to always remind me to have fun, even though you look a little stupid. And so, I had to pack up my stuff on a Friday night and, walk a mile to my car wearing my mariachi hat and my suit. And, I got some weird looks at the door. But
yeah, it's hard enough to do that walk of shame, let alone with a mariachi hat.
Oh, it was tough. But this opportunity just fell in my lap after that. Bloomberg was looking for a reporter to cover issues in the Midwest. And it was a time when they were doing more legislative coverage and regulatory coverage. And I threw my hat in the ring. I was looking for legal jobs, and this just popped up. And it was just a perfect fit, like manna from heaven.
Well, you're like, that's a sign from God. I'm going to go back to journalism and blend my legal expertise and experience into it.
Yeah, and I don't know. There were always these things where, although I loved law, my partner, who was giving me work would be like, which one do you think you love more, Alex? Like, do you love the journalism or you love the law? And I was like, flat out, like, definitely journalism, definitely. It's nice not to have to shade the truth, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And it's not that it's bad for attorneys to do so. You really have to, put things out for your client and work through, what is true to make the best argument you can. But at the same time, there were days when I was like, well, this might be true, but it doesn't feel very good.
Right.
And, now there are no days where I say, this doesn't feel good. And that's great.
Yeah, I think, and you know this, and I think a lot of our listeners know that the law is designed to get to the truth. It's imperfectly designed, and it is imperfect at getting to the truth, and often doesn't. But it's, if everybody's doing their job, if each side is doing their job, and sometimes there's more than two sides, and if the judge is calling balls and strikes and doing his or her job, and if there's a jury and they do their job, then theoretically everybody doing their job should lead to a truth, hopefully the truth. But you kind of cut out the middleman in a way. You get to assess and discern what is truthful and put that there. But that brings me to maybe the last subject I wanted to cover with you, and that is truth telling. Because nowadays, at least for me, and I think a lot of hopefully people that are looking to be educated and not stay in their information silo, they're looking at different sources. Certainly Bloomberg is a great one, and the work that you do is a terrific one. And then arriving at a truth based on looking at those sources. Some of them are real-time social media sources. Some of them are more traditional media. How do you see yourself fitting into that process? And, as you look back to what the newspaper and journalism was and what it's becoming, how do you see that all fitting together and evolving for you and for people that appreciate the news? And let your dog weigh in on that too.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay.
The animals are really far away, but for some reason I can hear them.
They don't like that question, apparently.
They hate it, but I really like it.
Okay,
so the future to me seems to be heading in a couple different directions. And if I may be so bold, I'm just a reporter, although I've got, 15 years of experience. What I've seen is smaller outlets really struggle, right? As the bigger outlets find ways to be more important to readers' lives. And for outlets like mine, Bloomberg, we have different products that are really important to small subsets of the economy, right? We have the terminal, which is the numbers machine that helps traders analyze and make a bunch of money. And my reporting can help feed that, right? And my colleagues too. And we also have a subset of big law and medium law customers that rely on extremely quick, accurate news. And they rely on, exclusive reporting that only we do because we're getting paid to look at cool legal issues and the different, practitioners and personalities. But at the same time, they're paying a lot of money for it. We're talking about thousands of dollars for the chance to use these tools.
Right.
And then on the flip side, you have more of the populist press, which, I was a part of for years before I jumped back into journalism and legal journalism. And that has struggled, right? It wasn't unusual for me at the small town newspaper to write 4 stories a day for minimum wage. And, even my colleagues at the bigger newspapers, in big metro cities, right? They're not making like median salaries for like what the people in that city make. The companies that are trying to keep the profits going and the lights on, they can't hire as many people as they want. You see fewer copy editors, which is a big thing. For folks that might not realize, the copy editors are the ones that make sure I don't look stupid before the story goes up online. Mm-hmm. And so you kind of have an environment of the haves and have-nots, right? My company that I'm so lucky to work for, it's a have. We have great resources, amazing editors, really, really good technology, and access to all these things. And, the people out there, burning the pavement in local news, they really struggle. And it's hard not to see more of that happening, right? The nationalization of news and the really just down bottom importance of having like really great information quickly, that seems to really benefit the big, organizations that supply that information fast. So I honestly see, folks in the legal industry continuing to do great journalism and work really hard. Same thing with financial journalism. But it's hard to see, especially local and kind of state populist press, the papers that, I grew up reading and loving. It's hard to see that not shrinking in coming years.
Yeah, definitely see signs of that. And of course, those are the people I talk to more often, friends that are in that, like you. I have friends in that space. Is there a place for Bloomberg and other national news outlets to kind of fill that void? I mean, obviously, a lot of the stories that you cover emanate from local news. It's a case that percolates up, or maybe it's just a good example of something that's happening that's an application of a Supreme Court ruling. So certainly in that aspect, your news has a local source. But what do you see your space in particular doing to fill that void, if anything?
Yeah, you do see national organizations filling some of this void sometimes. Axios is a good example where they have, sort of built out different local small branches. And you occasionally see, this philanthropist or that philanthropist looking to invest, things like that. Patch.com was a good example a while back, trying to restart this sort of local movement. And you've seen legislatures try to tackle it too. California is a good example. But I'm not really sure whether or not the big outlets are going to be heading that way. Obviously, it's above my pay grade.
Sure. For now, maybe one day.
For now, yeah. The things that play really well, even locally, are national topics, right? So if I were to pick up the Journal Sentinel, the thing that I read growing up and still love, you're going to see amazing state-based reporting, right? You're also going to see stuff that's national, and a lot more national than when I was growing up.
Right.
So yeah, the thing that I hope is whenever a national reporter like me comes in and sees a local issue, that we're not parachuting, right? That we're actually taking the time to learn about local flavor and opinions and ethics and get into the story something that makes it great.
Yeah.
And your friends and networks in Jacksonville have been great for that, as have other amazing attorneys around Florida that have really helped.
Yeah, I like that. So there is a tendency, or at least opportunity, for national news folks from big cities to, as you say, parachute into a city and bring judgment, derision, maybe a populist perspective. I remember when the Super Bowl was held in Jacksonville in 2005, I think it was. I could be off. But, the national news came to cover that sporting event. And, you could say what you want about Jacksonville, and some of it would be deserved, but there was a lot of the Waffle House capital of the world and that kind of stuff, which, was funny and maybe not so off base, but it was also a caricature of a city instead of an attempt to try to get to understand it. The dog has made it to the mic.
Yeah, it looks like someone let them free.
It's all good. We're almost done anyway.
Yeah, and I'm worried about that, right? A lot as a national journalist, and for that reason, I try to stick to the impact too, right? And that's at least my philosophy on things is if you stick to the impact and you don't try to color things with an ethic, then you can make it a little less about derision or compliment, right? And make it more about, well, what's the news here? What's the nugget? How are we going to learn something from this and move forward?
Yeah, that makes sense. Alex, I really admire how you've managed your career and your life and your family. And now I realize you manage your dogs really well. So thanks for coming and sharing your unique path and all the cool first rodeos along the way with us.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Mike. Take it easy.
Well, there you have it. Alex Ebert of Bloomberg News of Wisconsin. And what a cool guy, so capable of self-reflection and sort of looking at the past and projecting to the future for news and his personal approach to things. And I think you'll see it in his stories. We didn't really talk much about some of his individual stories, but he's talked about divisiveness within appellate courts. For those in the legal profession, you know, there's a bunch of lawyers, bunch of judges on a court, and sometimes there's divisiveness within them. And yet they have to come together to write opinions, to make decisions. And they don't all break along party lines. A lot of them break or don't break at all. There's a lot of unification, and he has a really good piece that talks about that. So highly recommend you looking at Bloomberg News, in particular following stories that Alex Ebert has written. I really appreciate you joining us for this episode. I think if you look back at some of our other episodes, if you like this one, you would enjoy the one with Kate Snow, one of our earlier episodes. We featured Stacey Newman, who is a producer at CNN, and covering news people is always interesting, and it's fun to turn the table on them because they're so used to asking questions, and it's fun to see how they respond when you ask questions of them, and they're very self-reflective and use a different part of their brain and different tools. I do appreciate you listening. I do hope you'll subscribe to the My First Rodeo podcast on whatever platform you like to listen to it on. I hope you'll share this episode and others with your friends, and I hope you'll come back next time and listen on the My First Rodeo podcast. My First